ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tharik Hussain. I'm going to be your chair stroke host for the evening, I understand. Thank you again for joining us on this wonderful sold out event, both in person and those of you that are online, to celebrate the marvelous work by our very special guest on the fascinating Ottoman cultural legacy, almost exactly 100 years since the Muslim Empire's collapse. Your itinerary for this evening is as follows. Shortly, our very special guest will present her work for approximately half an hour or so, right? Yeah. After this, I will moderate a question and answer session, which will then be followed by refreshments and the opportunity to get this beautiful book signed by our guest. The evening will then come to a close at around 9 p.m. But first, a little bit about this delightful institute. The Yunus Emre Institute was established as a foundation in 2007, with operations beginning in 2009. The aim here is to increase awareness of Turkish culture, support the learning of the Turkish language, and stimulate greater exchange in the fields of arts, culture, science, and education. Named after the famous 13th century poet Yunus Emre, there are a total of 66 branches across 54 countries, with this one housing an extensive library open to students and academics. The Institute regularly holds an array of classes and events to teach and promote traditional and contemporary Turkish art and culture. And since opening its doors here in 2010, Yunus Emre Institute London has become an important centre in cultural exchange and the improvement of the bonds of friendship between Turkey and the United Kingdom. Today's event is part of the Institute's Arts and Culture Lecture Series, which has been a regular feature here since 2017. If you are active on social media, please do tag the Institute at YEELONDRA on any of the main social media platforms. Some of the forthcoming arts and culture courses and workshops here include those in learning how to play the oud and the ney, tezhip, which is the art of illumination, husn-i-hat, calligraphy, and ebru, paper marbling. Other upcoming events at the Institute include the Noble Traditional Turkish Arts Exhibition on the 28th of November, Young Scholar Seminar Series, Philosophy of Nature and Architecture in the Age of Computation, 29th of November, a talk by Sir Terence Clarke, The Evolution of the Saluki or Tazi as an Enduring Part of the Cultural Heritage of the Middle East, 8th of December. And I understand Sir Terence is with us today. And now, ladies and gentlemen, a little bit about our very special guest. Diana Darke is a Middle East cultural expert with a special focus on Syria. She has degrees in Arabic from Oxford University and in Islamic art and architecture from SOAS, London. Diana has more than 35 years experience specializing in the region, working for both government and commercial sectors. Among her publications are the highly acclaimed My House in Damascus, An Inside View of the Syrian Crisis, The Merchant of Syria, The Last Sanctuary, and The Last Sanctuary in Aleppo. Frequently invited to speak at international events and media, including the BBC, PBS, TRT, Al Jazeera, and France 24, Diana's work on Syria has been published by the BBC, the Sunday Times, the Guardian, and the Financial Times. She's also a non-resident scholar at Washington's think tank, the Middle East Institute. Most recently, her 2020 book, Stealing from the Saracens, How Islamic Architecture Shaped Europe, received 3 Book of the Year 2020 awards. And her latest book, which she will be talking about tonight, The Ottomans, A Cultural Legacy, was published on the 29th of September, 2022. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Diana Darke.
Well, thank you very much, Tharik, and thank you very much to everybody for coming and to the Yunus Emre Institute. It's a great honor to be here. And as Tharik mentioned, the reason for this book is that it's 100 years since the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. And invariably, the focus with the Ottomans is on the final bloody decades. And so many books have been written about that. And so when Thames Hudson asked me if I would write a cultural history, I said I would prefer to write a cultural legacy, because I feel that people need to understand a much broader picture of the Ottomans than just these final bloody decades, which have colored everybody's view and given them so many prejudices: the terrible Turk, the sick man of Europe, all of these stereotypes that so many people grew up with, if you like, in the education system I went through, at any rate. And these stereotypes linger, and they need to be challenged. So my reason for writing the book really was to showcase, if you like, a complete range of things to do with the Ottomans, things they were responsible for, which are perhaps less known, less well known. And I also focus quite a bit on the early stages, the origins. Just to mention that Turkey, I have a special interest in Turkey. It was because of Turkey that I first began my writing career. These are the two that are still in print, but I started writing books about Turkey, travel books, back in the 1980s, when nobody else was writing travel books about Turkey. So, I feel I owe a huge debt to Turkey for generating my writing career. And The Merchant of Syria is about an Ottoman family, an Ottoman textile family. I do feel I know Turkey quite well, although it's worth saying that the Ottomans themselves never referred to themselves as Turks. It's an interesting thing that once they had established the state, they thought of themselves as Ottomans, not Turks. So what ethnic grouping you were from became irrelevant. So to that extent, it was the complete opposite of today's nation state, if you like, the complete opposite of Ataturk, and where being a Turk became a badge of honor. Because in the Ottoman times, in 1299, when the Ottoman state was first founded, a Turk was almost a sort of disparaging word, as a sort of country bumpkin, illiterate shepherd kind of word. So the Ottomans wanted to show that they were no longer Turks. It didn't matter whether you were a Turk or any ethnic grouping. The point is, you were an Ottoman. You were now part of this all-embracing state. And I'm sure most of you know this anyway, but just a very quick context, if you like, that the reason that Osman, the founder of the empire, began in that part, that red patch there near Iznik and Bursa, is because he and his tribe had been driven out from the Central Asian steppes with their flocks of sheep, escaping the Mongol horde. I mean, the Mongols were the big, terrifying force of that time, and in order to find safe pasture land, they just had to keep moving further and further westwards. And the weakest place was the Byzantine Empire, which was crumbling at that time. And so every time it just kept moving eastwards, and the Seljuks were also crumbling. But Osman was awarded land around Iznik and Bursa by the Seljuk Sultan as a reward for his help in fighting against the Ottomans. So personalities obviously make a huge difference. When you've got a story of one empire that lasted for 600 years and spanned 3 continents and encompassed 72 different ethnic groupings with 12 different languages, you're going to, the force of personality is going to be a very strong element in that. And Osman himself was an extremely intelligent and incredibly great strategist and fierce fighter, and obviously very skilled horseman, like all like all the other Turkish beys of that time. And the women, it's worth stressing, were also very active in the fighting. I mean, women would fight alongside the men. That's why they designed the trousers to wear, which then got renamed as bloomers. It's a funny little aside that, you know, one of the things I mention in the book. But so women would fight with babies strapped to their backs. You know, they were phenomenally tough. And Osman recognized that they, as nomadic tribesmen, if they were going to found a state, they would need the skills of everybody that they could find. So they invited everybody to join them who would be able to help build them the state. So honest merchants, poets, literary figures, you know, skilled administrators. They recognized that they didn't have these skills, and so they didn't mind where these skills came from. They didn't mind, you know, whether they were from Byzantine or you know, Armenian, or anybody who wanted to join them was able to do so. And the glue of the state that they established was trade. When you see an Ottoman map, all the boundaries that they show are not real boundaries at all. It's just for administrative purposes. The Ottoman Empire was like a huge single market. And the administrative boundaries were just drawn on maps for tax purposes, because they were very good archivists at documenting you know, the tax revenues, but also very forgiving. So, for example, if an area was experiencing drought or famine, they would reduce the tax burden on that area until it had recovered sufficiently, and then would increase it again, because the idea was that everybody would become a productive citizen and pay their taxes, and in return, the state would guard them, would also give them a community. And this is Bursa. Now, the first Ottoman capital, it was the Ottoman capital for about 40 years. And Bursa is recognized by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site for being a model Ottoman city in setting up this unique urban planning system, like a sort of community hub. It's designed from the bottom up. So the mosque is the center, and then the souks and the madrasas and the khans and the hammams, everything is built around it, the soup kitchens, to offer services to the community for free to everybody of every ethnicity and religion. And then a community would build up around this community hub. And the idea was then that produce, so agriculturally, this was a very rich area that Osman had been given by the Seljuk Sultan. And in the hills around Bursa, 7 Waqf villages were set up by Osman's sons, and the produce was sold in Bursa, and it was the profit from that enabled all these community services to continue. So it was a self-perpetuating non-profit system, and you can still go and visit some of these villages in the hills around Bursa. Quite remarkable. They still feel like medieval villages with their cobbled streets. And this is Bursa's silk caravanserai Han, and silk became incredibly important in Bursa, and the textile industry was a great source of wealth and prestige, and many silk items were made, not just for sultans and for the court, but also for clergy's vestments, and it became the great fashion in European nobility, had to be dressed in Turkish silks, and then of course Turkish carpets become again a real expression, if you like, of the Ottoman aesthetic. The chapter I actually enjoyed writing most in this book was the chapter on the Ottoman aesthetics, because it's just so fascinating trying to work out how the tribal origins are reflected in the carpets and the reasons for the different patterns, the different styles. I mean, it is a fascinating thing to try to unravel. So after the 40 years at Bursa, the second Ottoman capital is in Edirne, which is of course on the European mainland, Adrianople. And when you look at this map, which shows how the how the empire began to expand, you can also see how it expanded up into the north of the Black Sea there with the Crimea and what is today Ukraine. And again, people forget that Podalia up there was modern Ukraine. And the reason it was lost to the Ottomans was for the same reason as today, that the Russian imperial agenda was to expand, and they initiated wars to take over those areas, displacing hundreds of thousands of refugees, mainly Muslim, who then fled into the rest of the empire. So Edirne, very unusual. It was the Ottoman capital, the second capital for nearly 100 years. And this is the Ottoman palace in Edirne, unlike anything else, really. I mean, if you look at that design, it's like a tent, an Ottoman tent, or they were always circular with a conical roof like that. It's like a tent perched on top of a sort of lookout post, and it has a central water feature that runs down the middle. And you can still see this in Edirne. Now, this is the synagogue in Edirne, and I'm showing this to illustrate that still in Edirne, there's a functioning synagogue. And of course, the Ottomans had this policy with refugees of accepting any refugee from everywhere. Didn't matter what religion, what ethnicity. So at the Reconquista with Ferdinand and Isabella, when they kicked out all the Jews, they were welcomed into the Ottoman Empire. And the same with Muslims that were kicked out a little later. And indeed, many Christians were also thrown out because they were the wrong kind of Christian. And they too took refuge in the Ottoman Empire, because to be an Ottoman was a desirable thing at that time. People wanted to be an Ottoman because you were, as a minority especially, you were going to be protected. So now we're coming to the third capital, obviously, of Constantinople, Istanbul. And when, at the time that Mehmet, the conqueror there, sniffing his flower, at the time of the conquest, they were actually, of course, you might imagine, I certainly used to imagine that Constantinople was conquered from the east by hordes of, tribesmen, sort of, rushing in. Whereas, in fact, of course, it was from the European mainland, from Edirne, with a mixed Christian and Muslim army. These things are very complex. I mean, even with the much later second siege of Vienna in 1683, 100,000 Hungarian Christians fought on the Ottoman side, along with thousands of Greeks, Armenians, Slavs, and Transylvanian Protestants who were disenchanted with the Habsburg Catholic fervor. So these things are never black and white. The sort of narrative where the sort of, the noble Christian Europe is fighting the despotic Muslim Orient is a sort of Disney version of history. So we have to sort of see this from the Ottoman perspective. So I'm showing here a satellite view of the Bosphorus to show what we think of as this divide between Europe and Asia. But the Ottomans never thought like that. They never thought in terms of Europe and Asia. So when, even today, we tend to think of Turkey as either a bridge to the Orient or a kind of sponge to absorb the chaos that the Middle East might be generating. when of course, you know, the Ottomans never saw themselves as a bridge or a sponge of any sort. And so now in the capital, the third capital, which obviously remained the capital up until the end, the Topkapi Palace, again, architecturally so unlike anything that was happening in Europe at that time. It's discreet, it's low rise, only 2 stories high, you know, not ostentatious at all. And it's laid out, many people say, in the way of a sort of nomad encampment, where the sort of courtyards that you go through are like the way that an encampment is laid out, that you have to go through to reach the Sultan at the furthest one, where he's most protected. And this is an aerial view of the Topkapi in a Turkish miniature, which shows that rather wonderful way that Turkish miniatures have of doing a bird's eye view of a scene. So you look down as a bird would see it. And from that, you can see how the gardens are all around the palace. And Mehmet himself used to work in those gardens as a, he just enjoyed for relaxation, working there. And he ordered tulips to be planted in all the parks and fields around Istanbul that he had set up. And the tulip, of course, became the symbol of the Ottomans. So many different ways. In fact, the cover of the book is one of the tulip panels from the Rüstem Pasha Mosque, which I think has got more than 80 different tulip designs in it. And so this is the Tulip Folly, a painting by a Frenchman about the tulip craze that seized Europe. And you've got a Dutchman there guarding one rare bulb while the rest of the bulbs are trying to be destroyed. And this is thought of as the first asset bubble bursting ever, the sort of monopoly. It sort of makes me think about cryptocurrencies now, where you have something that appears to be not worth anything. So that one little bulb that he's guarding, you could apparently buy a sort of a chateau with that one bulb. It became completely insane. So the kitchens now at the Topkapi, because now that we move on to food, another huge legacy of the Ottomans. I mean, over 60 chefs were employed there, where they were recruited from all over the empire. They were rigorously tested, and the recipes were kept secret. But of course, as well as all the food that Ottomans developed, you know, yogurt and the hummus and all the use of fruits and nuts, so many things really which have dominated Eastern Mediterranean cuisine. But coffee became a huge thing. Of course, coffee originally from Yemen in Mocha, but it found its way in the early 1500s via Syria into Istanbul. And Suleiman the Magnificent was a very keen coffee drinker. And so a whole culture grew up over coffee, with the chief coffee maker and special coffee cups being made in the ceramic kilns of Iznik and Kütahya. And the craze spread to Europe. Again, at the failed siege in 1683, when the Ottoman army had to suddenly abandon everything, all their stocks were left, and there was a few sackfuls of coffee beans, and nobody had a clue what to do with it on the Viennese side, except for one soldier who had been a prisoner of the Ottomans for a couple of years. So he understood what it was and realized this is coffee. And so he gradually gave Vienna the taste for it. And of course, in Vienna, it's still drunk in what they call Wiener art, which is always with a glass of water, the Ottoman way. And from there, of course, it spread into this country, the whole coffee culture. By 1700, you had coffees, you know, you had the Sultaness's head rivaling the King's Head pub, you know, as a, and they were known as penny universities, where you know, you could, for the cost of a penny, you could go and have learned conversations with the intellectuals of the day. And also at Vienna, that siege, a lot of musical instruments were abandoned. And so Europeans for the first time came across these range of musical instruments, which they then gradually learnt to adopt. And water systems, again, huge legacy here of the way Ottomans thought about water. I mean, when Sinan, who was the court architect working for Suleiman the Magnificent, along with two other sultans, he was the chief water engineer before he became court architect. And one of the first things he did was to improve the water system and rebuild aqueducts from the Belgrade forest leading into Istanbul. And of course, the other thing was to bequeath a drinking fountain, and that is Sinan's own drinking fountain at the side of his house in Istanbul, there on the right-hand side. And this is the Yunus Emre drinking fountain in Vienna. I couldn't resist putting that in because, again, it's just amazing that in the heart of Vienna, there is the Yunus Emre drinking fountain in the park there. Now, Sinan, one of his great triumphs was the Süleymaniye Mosque. And the remarkable thing here is to illustrate how Ottomans were true environmentalists at core, because Sinan, in designing the mosque, apart from getting the water system obviously to flow straight into the courtyard for the ablutions, the soot from the candles and the oil lamps went up and was designed to be filtered off into a water channel where it was turned into an ink, very, very high quality ink, which was then used in calligraphy, which had insect repellent qualities. So, I mean, real 16th century recycling flair that I'm sure, we could learn something from. So the calligraphy, again, a huge Ottoman, thing that they used and developed a great deal. Every sultan had his own signature, his own thughra, and all the sultans wrote their own poetry. And even on the battlefield, is people like what we were taught to call Selim the Grim, which of course, Yavuz, in fact, is better translated as resolute. It's another example of this sort of, cultural overtones, if you like. But I personally found the poetry of the sultans fascinating, and I quote a certain amount of it in the book because I just think it's so interesting to see it. So this thing about environmentalism and conservationism and closeness to nature that I think does go back to the Ottoman beginnings as a nomadic tribe. They had to live alongside nature and look after it. And so this is deeply embedded in Ottoman culture. So you find these extraordinary bird houses, sort of bird palaces on the sides of mosques and caravanserais in Istanbul and in other parts of the country. And the Ottomans set up the very first animal hospital way before Europe ever thought of any such thing, which was for helpless storks to repair their broken wings. And again, on the religious side, in what we referred to today as the Balkans, this is in Bosnia near Mostar, the Blagaj Teke, Bektashi Teke. It's important to stress that right from the start with Osman, all of the Ottoman sultans had alongside them a Sufi religious spiritual guide who fought alongside them as well. But the Sufis and the Ottomans were very closely aligned, and so many of these tekke still exist actually in the Balkans, and you can still visit some of them. In North Macedonia, there's a Bektashi tekke that you can still visit, and this is the painted mosque there, most unusual design. In Sarajevo, which is sometimes called the Jerusalem of Europe because of the the synagogue, the mosque, and the church, all off on the same square. But this in Sarajevo is an Ottoman restaurant that still serves totally Ottoman cuisine that you can still eat using Ottoman utensils as well. And it's still on the subject of food. Again, this whole thing about welcoming refugees and generally charitable acts in the Great Irish Potato Famine in the 19th century, the Sultan wanted to give £10,000 to the Irish to help them. And Queen Victoria protested and said, you can't give that much. That's way more than I was going to give. And so he had to reduce it. But then he sent 5 ships laden with food instead. And a film is being made about this called Famine that is in production at the moment. So that will be a fascinating one to watch out for. Also in what is today the Balkans, this is in Kosovo, in Prizren, another example of a sort of another Jerusalem, if you like, in the Balkans, where again you've got the mosque, the synagogue, and the 2 different. You've got an Orthodox church and a Catholic church, all on the same square. It's absolutely buzzing with young people sitting in the cafes there along the side. I mean, I was just blown over by Prizren, actually. Extraordinary place, well worth visiting. Now, health, again, a lot of people would never dream of associating Ottomans with a health system, but they actually pioneered vaccination. So this stamp is commemorating 300 years of smallpox vaccination back in 1717. And as you can see, it's administered by a woman to a child in a Turkish bath. That's how it was administered. And it found its way over to this country via the British ambassador's wife, who herself had been disfigured by smallpox and wanted to get her son injected. And she was then convinced that it worked and tried to bring it back to this country, where she was met with great skepticism. But eventually it was adopted, but because of the level of skepticism, it was initially given to prisoners just to check that it really was okay. And once they were sure it was okay, then of course the royal family got it first and everyone else later. Whereas in the Ottoman system, everybody got it, literally everybody. You could not attend school unless you had been vaccinated. Refugees, migrants who came in, everybody had to have their vaccination. It was very, very strictly controlled. And again, the sort of hygiene system, public bathing. Istanbul had public toilets, hundreds and hundreds of them at a time when in Europe it was thought purer not to bathe at all. So, and quarantine, the Ottomans had to deal with really quite a lot of plagues, quite apart from the Black Death itself. There were whole waves of plagues in Europe at this time, and they had a system of quarantine. So they had quarantine centers. This one happens to be in Hebron in the occupied West Bank. And they had stations along the Dardanelles where ships coming into Istanbul had to go into isolation to make sure that nobody was infected and was going to bring a plague into Istanbul. So this was a very, very well developed system of healthcare that the state provided for everybody. And then finally, this is just another example of the sort of Ottoman urban planning, if you like. These 2 Ottoman towns are again UNESCO World Heritage Sites in what is today Albania, Berat and Gjirokasta. And the way they've been designed, they're always built on a slope like this so that air can circulate, everybody has a view, there's better drainage, it's a much healthier way to live. And then the interiors are quite reminiscent, if you like, of that sort of versatile tent arrangement where you can have your living room can change into a bedroom by just bringing stuff in and out of cupboards. It's the same sort of mentality of a versatile way of life. And the UNESCO entry actually says that they are testaments, these places, to a remarkable, inclusive way of life where everybody of different ethnicities and religions could live alongside each other in a way that today is vanishing. It actually says that, and that kind of brings it home to you that fewer and fewer people are alive today who can remember what it felt like to live in cities like this, where it was normal to be in a mixed environment. So that's it.
Thank you, Diana, for that wonderful walkthrough. What is clearly, an absolutely fascinating cultural legacy. Something, of course, as an Ottoman enthusiast myself, I could talk to you about all evening. But seeing as all these wonderful people have turned up to ask you potentially lots of questions, I'm first going to open it up to the floor. And then after that, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you a few myself. So where should we go first, ladies and gentlemen? Who wishes? Yeah, over here. Are we going to be using a microphone? Yes. So I'll try and repeat the questions for everybody. If it's not clear.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I was quite fascinated when you said in the beginning that the Ottomans never considered themselves to be Turks. Was this feeling among the ruling elite or the class, or did it penetrate down to the common public as well? Was there a sense of being Turkish among the common, people, and did that create any problems? Did they feel themselves to be, in a way, superior to the other ethnicities?
Sorry, are you saying that they considered themselves Turks?
Yeah, was the feeling of being Ottoman and not Turkish just among the Ottoman rulers, or did it penetrate down to the common man on the street, for example?
Right, because I think, Diana, you said that the term was used more as a slur back then, right?
Yes, after the time that the state was founded, yes, once the state began to grow and advance. But of course, Europe persisted in calling it the Turks, always referred to the Turks. But it's interesting, the Ottomans themselves, and it's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about it, actually, your question, but from what I've read, I think that, probably initially people did still think of themselves as Turks, but I think as the empire spread more and people, moved across this huge common market, as I said, sort of vast single market where trade was encouraged and flourished, I think it increasingly didn't matter whether you were a Turk or a Jew or Armenian or anything. You were Ottoman, and so
you were part of the state.
You were part of the state, exactly. You were part of the Ottoman state. And I can't now remember it, but I was very struck by there's a motto of the Ottoman state, which translates as something like the eternal state. I'm sure somebody here will know it. It's quite Arabic, and it's something like.
The other thing that strikes me when you say that about the motto is, of course, I'm sure you're aware of the Ottomans getting involved with the Dutch trying to get away from the Catholic occupation over there. And during that time, there was that famous medal constructed. And in that, of course, they say, and I'm going to paraphrase here, I'd rather be Turk than Catholic. So it's interesting, the Europeans, Western Europeans were using that term to describe them. This was during the period of, I think, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. So others were clearly referring to them as Turk, but whether or not they themselves self-identified in that way.
Again, the Orthodox Christians often also said, better the Sultan's turban than the Pope's mitre, because the Catholics persecuted them. And so they the Orthodox were much better looked after within the Ottoman state.
Yeah, I think it's often overlooked that it wasn't just Muslims and Jews that found refuge in the empire. Many Christian minorities found refuge in the empire. But this plays into the narrative that was obviously developed much later. Just in the same way when you mentioned the battles. And of course, one of the famous battles that I covered was the 1389 Battle of Kosovo, where it's often depicted as the Ottomans fought against the Serbians. They forget to mention that several minor Serbian princes were on the side of the Ottomans.
Yes.
So
Another thing, actually, I forgot to mention, Mehmet the Conqueror, at the time that he took Constantinople. Many a Byzantine historian actually said that in a way there had been so much intermarriage, so many sultans had married Byzantine princesses up to that point, that he had almost the same amount of dynastic claim to the throne as any Byzantine emperor would have done.
So I suppose it was apt to be called Caesars after this point.
Yes, yes. I mean, the amount of intermarriage was considerable, often for, political dynastic reasons. I mean, the same as...
For allegiances.
Yes, allegiances and that sort of thing. Yes, yes.
Any other questions? One at the back there. And to the left over here as well afterwards.
Oh, yes, hello. With the Ottomans and their rise, how much would we say it was more of a lightning in a bottle, where it was like, when you look at the circumstances, it was very unlikely that it would happen again, considering the chaos with the Byzantiums, the chaos with the Seljuks, and the decentralization of power with the Mongols in Anatolia and Iraq, and with the amount of pure silver that was really flowing through Anatolia during this time, which really made it a perfect opportunity for a state to rise in such incredible circumstances.
So sorry, is your question, could it happen again?
Like, how much of the rise itself was
down to circumstance?
Because of the circumstances, and less of the individuals, but more of the circumstances.
Okay, so I guess the question is, how much of it was down to the fact that it was almost the perfect mix for the Ottomans to rise up, rather than these charismatic individual Ottoman leaders, I guess?
Well, I think the reason that you have to say it must be the charismatic leaders is because all of Turkey was made up of Turkish beyliks at that time.
Yes.
There were many, heads of their tribes, but it was Osman, out of all of them, who rose to the top and triumphed. And I mean, it could have, in theory, been any one of the other ones, but it was he who was able to push it through. Having said that, there are historians who say that obviously the fact that the Byzantines were weakened by that point makes a big difference. One of the reasons, incidentally, that Constantinople was so weakened was by the Fourth Crusade in 1204, where the Crusaders, supposedly going off to the Holy Land, diverted and attacked Constantinople. The Orthodox Christians, looted it, ran off with all their treasures and things, and most of Venice and European treasuries are stuffed full of things looted from Constantinople then. So, I mean, Byzantine Empire was crumbling at its end. So obviously that made it easier, although it still had its massive walls, which had to be breached. But then also the Black Death, that was 1348, and that hit Europe very badly in sort of insanitary urban settings. The Ottomans being a sort of more sanitary and nomadic as well. They were sort of used to living out of doors a lot.
Yeah.
Some historians say that they were able to benefit from the havoc that it wrought in urban societies, and that gave them an extra leverage. But again, it's a very interesting question, isn't it? To what extent is just the luck of the moment that will never repeat itself? But I think that the fact that he, out of all of those Turkish beyliks, rose to the top, he was a pretty special a special individual, I think.
Absolutely.
Well, there were others actually, just in their immediate vicinity as well. But yes, they're pushing right up against the Byzantine Empire very consciously. Yeah, although it's interesting that that's the land they were given, and they had to fight for it. They were challenged and had to fight for it very, very hard. I don't know if you've been to that part of Turkey, but it's absolutely beautiful, actually. I mean, not many people go to that area, but it is stunning.
I think we had a question over there to the left. Sorry, Milo.
Thank you so much for your talk. Without sounding too idealistic, the Ottoman Empire was probably the most culturally, ethnically, and religiously diverse polity in Europe during a time when the European states were trying to create as much homogeneity as possible in their own ideas of what a nation state would be, stamping out linguistic diversity, religious diversity especially. With that in mind, as a historian, how do you reflect on the way the modern Turkish Republic has really followed the examples of Britain and France and Spain and tried to kind of force that nation state homogenous model on the former Ottoman Empire? And as a result, due to a lot of factors, the creation of the Republic and population swaps and all sorts of kind of people fleeing, that it's now become a kind of, in a way, like an imitation of what the Western nation state model was trying to do in an earlier period. So yeah, I just wanted to know your reflections as a historian about the loss of some of that kind of very unique historic diversity.
Yeah, I mean, it is one of those ironies, and I do often think about that the Ottoman Empire represented almost the diametric opposite of what Ataturk set up, where everybody had to be a Turk. There could be nobody except a Turk, so a Kurd couldn't be a Kurd, he had to be a mountain Turk. And with all the problems that has led to, and the crushing out of other languages, the exchange of populations, I mean, the chaos of that. I mean, just imagining that makes me feel quite ill. The thought of what happened to those people's lives, that population exchange was so major. It's just unthinkable now to think that you could do something as dramatic as that so fast. I mean, what Ataturk did, it's just astonishing. I mean, the way changing of the alphabet, I mean, the complete rejection of the Ottoman past, the complete, you had to emulate Europe. You had to be like Europe. You had to be Western. And of course, there's now been, a sort of a backlash, if you like, in the form of Erdogan, with sort of bringing religion more to the fore. I mean, these things are so complicated. I mean, the book isn't about that, although there are obvious things that you can't help noticing about historical parallels.
And just on that, one of the things the book is about, of course, is the millet system, which you explain in great detail. And most historians accept this is one of the most enlightened systems Europe had seen at that time. Did you find any evidence of how it may have influenced modern Western European thinking on, concepts of tolerating secularism, should we say?
Not in Europe, to be honest. Funnily enough, where I have noticed, though, is in Syria, believe it or not. I know, again, it's absolutely ironic, isn't it, that the Syrian legal system, the head of state is nominally a Muslim. I'm totally anti-Assad, by the way, so that everybody is clear about this, but I'm talking about the legal system now, where, for example, Christians have their own courts where they can take all their domestic and marital disputes and whatever. They can sort all those sorts of civil disputes out themselves, basically. So there's no involvement. They're allowed to do that completely separately. And I don't think, I'm not aware in Europe anyway, that we have anything similar to that actually. Here.
So you haven't seen any evidence of how it might have inspired the modern secular state in order to sort of let people have that autonomy without having to necessarily conform?
I'm struggling to think of
no worries, it was just something that came to me when I read that particular section, and it's something that somebody's asked me in the past myself. We have a hand up here. Yes.
I wanted to ask, in how many languages will the book be translated to? And I also saw that the book was published in China. So is China the new place where English books are being printed?
Well, you know more than me. I didn't know it was
I didn't know it was published in China.
No. Are you sure you're thinking of the same book? Really?
Oh, wow. Okay.
Goodness, well, it's news to me. It's news
Fantastic.
to me.
Your big
And
news in
yes,
China
yes,
then.
yes. Well,
Are there plans for any translations yet?
I don't know is the answer. If there are,
There are.
there
Oh,
are, I
fantastic.
haven't been told.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
Are there? Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah. I think often what happens is obviously once the book is out, depending on the traction, depending
Yes,
on the
yes.
popularity,
Yes.
you have
yes.
translators
I mean,
approach, and
I
then
would
deals have to be
certainly
made.
hope it goes into Turkish. I mean, my goodness, you know, I really would hope it would go into Turkish. Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Indeed.
I would love to see it in Turkish. I
Yes.
would.
Well, it's certainly got the cover for it.
Yeah, yeah.
Any other? Yeah, at the back there.
So I've noticed there's a lot of Turkish historical series on the Ottoman period. So like Ertugrul or things like that. But to what extent can these series revive interest in Ottoman history, and how accurately have they done so?
So, Diana, do you want to comment on the accuracy of Ertugrul?
Well,
It's a question I get all the time.
yes. I mean, I think they're bound to generate interest,
Yeah.
yes, and fascination with the way things did. And I mean, I have seen the Ertugrul series, and I actually think it's done really well. It's great entertainment. My goodness, you know, the sword fighting is something else. You know? I personally don't like watching fighting normally, but when it comes to just the sheer skill of watching them fight with their swords, it has a certain fascination. And also, the thing I did find very interesting actually was that it shows the women making the rugs in the rug workshop and going and collecting the dyes, you know, the herbs to make the colors and stuff like that, which I gather that the amount of historical research that was done for the programs was considerable, and the producers scoured the country to find the correct you know, things to the furniture for the tents and the right kind of carts, you know, for when they were migrating. I think all of that is accurate. The props, if you like, and those scenes where they dismantle the tents and move the whole tribe, again, are absolutely fascinating to see that sort of thing enacted. It gives you a real sense of what they, you know, what they clearly had to go through actually in these migrations.
We have another one over here.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I actually wanted to ask you a question as your historian. Would you say that there was something that was particularly challenging or difficult to find out more about when you were writing this book? In terms of historical research, was there anything that you thought, I really wish there was more information about?
What was the most difficult thing to look into?
Yes. Well, it's again, it's an interesting question because one of the things I talk about in the introduction is that I don't think this has been done before, an attempt in one volume to cover the whole of the cultural legacy across the geographic spread of the three continents. Because, you know, most academics studying this period, well, they're not going to be studying anything as vast as that. You know, you'll get your Balkan specialists, you'll get your Arabic specialists, you'll get your Byzantine specialists, you'll get, you know, the ones who are only functioning on Turkey. I mean, the whole thing is so fragmented. So the challenge really was to, you know, from all this sort of fragmentation of knowledge, if you like, is to try to bring it into one accessible volume in a way that was balanced. I knew right from the start that I would get hammered for doing a book like this, because you're always going to get the people who say, oh, what about the Armenian genocide and all this sort of, you know, and again, there's this sort of desire to focus on all that negative stuff, which, you know, I mean, yes, terrible things happened. Terrible things happened at the end of every empire across history, you know. I mean, to try to pretend otherwise is pointless. But that's not what the book is about. But people will, and I've had it, you know, and I'm sure Tharik gets it too, that, you know, you kind of, you get hammered just because you're saying anything positive about the Ottomans, you know, it's sort of, how dare you say anything positive about them, you know,
I was
when they
saying
were
to you-
monsters, you know,
Exactly.
this sort of mentality. So,
Mm.
so you have to, you know, illustrate that this was simply not the case, and show it, you know, through the pictures and the text, and to try to explain it. So it wasn't so much that there wasn't a lack, that there was a difficult area. There's just so much that making the selection from such a vast subject was the challenge. It's like putting together a sort of, you know, a 1,000,000-piece jigsaw or something like that, you know.
On that note, I wanted to kind of ask, you said you tried to focus on the early period, and you know, the understanding is, of course, the early history wasn't documented straight away.
Yes,
It was
yes,
done much
yes.
more in hindsight.
That's right.
And
Yes,
and let's be frank, often when a dynasty is developing,
yes,
writers will write it
of
so that the
course.
dynasty is romanticized as
Yes,
well. So
yes, yes,
when you were looking back at some of that, including the period of Ertugrul, including
Yes.
the period of Osman,
yes.
how difficult was that?
Well, yes, obviously. I mean, there are big gaps,
Yeah.
there.
Would you say that was one of the more maybe difficult
Yes,
aspects of the research?
yes, yes, possibly, but you know, again, I think there's enough
There.
that is documented, that gives you a flavor. One of the most interesting things, actually, and I refer to this a couple of times, is a book that actually came out whilst I was writing this, called Prisoner of the Infidels,
Yes. I know.
about an Ottoman who was kept prisoner by the Habsburgs. And what, for 12 years or something?
Yes,
I think it's
very
quite a long period, basically. And he was passed from master to mistress, you know, and it's his attempts to escape. So it's the only,
Isn't it a translation?
yes, but it's autobiography did not exist. You know, it was an alien concept to write your own personal story. So this is the only Ottoman autobiography that exists. And that I found a very interesting little window into how an Ottoman of the time thought, especially when he was being kept prisoner by various, you know, Habsburg,
Western.
some of whom treated him well and some of whom treated him appallingly. You know, I mean, it's again a very complex picture, but a fascinating little window into it.
Thank you. We've got a question over here.
Thanks a lot. So whatever goes up has to come down. So from your experience studying the history, when does the cultural decline of the Ottoman Empire really start? And when does the imitation from Europe start? Because you gave the example of the Topkapi Palace, uniquely Ottoman. But if you see the later palaces like Dolmabahce, Italian Rococo and Baroque, so when does this kind of cultural decline exactly start, and why do you think so?
Yeah, well, that's not something I focus on, I'll be quite honest, because again, I think that's been covered a lot. There seems to me to be a particular fascination with the fall. And so I deliberately kept away from that. And to be frank, I'm not really that interested in when. I mean, to be frank, again, I think the reason, I mean, probably sometime in the 17th century is when it started to go wrong, because they were imitating Europe too much, in my view, and making too many concessions to Europe at their own expense. So they gave trading privileges away and lost out themselves as a result. You know, they kind of completely undermined themselves in a way that was naive, actually, and didn't realize what the consequences would be.
Hindsight is a great thing.
Yes, but personally, I find all that Baroque. I mean, I think the Dolmabahce is utterly hideous, absolutely hideous. And I hate any form of Baroque. I think it's overcompensation is the way I dismiss it in one word, you know.
I suppose another way of reframing that would be, when did you start to see in the cultural legacy this kind of cross-pollination of what you might call Western influence?
Yeah, well, particularly around then, basically, yeah, the 17th century.
17th century onwards.
Yes, 17th century onwards, yes.
And we're going to take one more, and then I'm going to have my time to. No?
It was actually, hi, thank you for that.
Okay.
It's just a follow-up question actually about how much Western influence did occur in the Ottoman Empire, and what can you, like, what examples could you give of that?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Oh, is it working?
Yeah.
Hi, I was just wondering, you spoke about Western influence.
Okay.
What kind, if you could give some examples, that'd be great.
Oh, so what kind of examples where there was a Western European influence on Ottoman culture?
Yes.
Okay, well, again, I don't focus on that at all because it's not what the book is about.
Sure.
You know, I think all that really starts to develop
Around the
in around the 17th century. They start to influence the style of furnishings, this type of, you know, so the sort of the low divans, if you like, around the main reception room start to get replaced by fancy armchairs, all of that, you know, because there's this thing that you have to copy Europe in order to be civilized. That was the undoing of the Ottomans, in my opinion.
And I guess at that point, they're obviously considering Europe to be superior in
Yes,
some way.
yes.
For you to be
Yes.
mimicking, because they say, you know, it's the
Yes.
greatest form of flattery, isn't it?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
We have a
yes.
question at the front, which we're going to take, and then, yeah.
What do you think is the future, if you will, of the Ottoman legacy? Do you think that this rehabilitation is going to continue?
Oh, you took my
Yeah.
question away from me now.
That is such an interesting question. And I actually end the book with exactly that point, that there is so much work being done now by a whole new generation of young Ottoman scholars who are mainly at Turkish universities. Because the Ottomans were, you know, the archives are just vast, and so many of them have not been properly looked at. And I know this in Syria, in Damascus, vast quantities of Ottoman archives, rooms and rooms of them. I've seen them. Nobody's ever looked at them. You could spend your entire life in one of these rooms and find nothing, you know.
Wasn't it banned for a while, research into the Ottoman legacy, or heavily discouraged?
Probably
I don't know.
heavily discouraged. I've not heard of a ban. Maybe a ban in Turkey.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
in-
yeah. Sorry,
I
I
mean,
thought you meant generally.
No,
That was a global ban.
because of this, because there is now more starting to come out. I mean, one of the very interesting Zoom events that I attended when I was writing this book was actually by two PhD students, one of whom was Greek and one of whom was Turkish. And they were each, their subjects were the architectural legacy in the other place. So the Greek was looking at the Turkish mainland things and vice versa. So they were, and what they were finding was very, very interesting. And I mean, you know, so I think pretty much my final sentence is that in another 100 years' time, everybody's view of the Ottoman legacy may be completely different again in the light of new things that have come out. I think it is an evolving subject. Yeah.
Right. So if you don't mind, I'm now going to ask a few of my
Oh God, I
questions.
know.
No, I'm actually going to throw one at you that I kept getting thrown at me, and I always struggle to address as well. We all know that the European view of the Ottomans, the Western European view, is very, very negative. And sadly, as you've seen, even when we travel through the Balkans, it's mixed. How much of that do you think, I mean, there's the obvious reasons because of the whole kind of Christianity versus Muslim narrative, but how much of that do you think is also down to the way in which, as you very nicely described earlier, Ataturk dealt with the Ottoman legacy? In other words, is it almost seen as, well, if they don't like their own heritage, why would the rest of us?
Well, actually, that is an interesting thought, isn't it? As it was utterly rejected by
the very people whose legacy it was.
Yes, yes.
So do you think that played a part in developing? Because of course we all know, any of us who have been educated in the West know all the alleged horrors, true or otherwise, because we know some of them are also fabrications. But yeah.
Well, in the Balkan area, my understanding is that but basically the communist years wiped out
So much of it.
so much of
So
it.
much.
So that, and I think this is something that you mentioned actually in your book, that you've got some Albanian friend who's a teacher, who says that the Ottomans in the history curriculum is covered in something like 2 pages or something. I mean, it's dismissed
Probably less.
in it's sort of completely, and it's the same in Bulgaria. You know,
Absolutely.
it is the education systems of those countries, sadly, you know, are perpetuating a very negative view.
Absolutely.
And even in Syria, where when Assad and Erdogan were best friends and used to go on holiday together, the Syrian curriculum referred to the Ottoman period as you know, the Ottoman rule. Now that they've fallen out, it's changed to the Ottoman occupation.
Yes.
You know, this is the way
Yes.
that politics influences
And the power of language.
the power of language and these little nuances
And
in
of
the
course,
way
in the
you
Balkans,
refer
it
to
became the
something.
Ottoman yoke.
Yes, yes.
Mm.
So much of that, and also one of the things actually I learned about in this, which I hadn't known about before, was the amount of Habsburg propaganda in the 19th century. I hadn't realized how efficient they were. You know, that there were these whole publications that came out that were very, very effective in creating this sort of very negative
Of demonizing.
demonizing. Yes, yes, and the art supported it. You know, when you've got
Absolutely.
illustrations of Turks, you know, they're always horrifically, you know,
And
violent
and a lot of the nation building narratives that were constructed around this time.
Yes, yes.
I guess we should end on what, you know, a big question, which you're probably going to say you hate answering. What is the greatest Ottoman legacy?
Ooh, I am, yes.
I don't think you'd like that question.
Well, no, I do like it. I do like it because there are so many things that I'm now struggling to fix on one. I personally think it's this wonderful combination, which I've never seen anywhere else in any other culture, of, and you see it, you know, there in that and in the carpets. It's this combination of rigor and toughness, which I think comes from the nomadic roots, and this incredible aesthetic sense and love of nature, and seeing that fuse. So you've got this toughness, you know, real grounded toughness, you know, real stamina and endurance and everything, alongside this love of beauty and nature. And I think that's terrific. And it shows in all the tile work and in all the decorative things. And I think I don't see that in other art, you know, legacies, if you like. I mean, it's I think it's unique actually to the Ottomans.
I think that's probably a wonderful note to end on. Thank you so much, Diana. And now, ladies and gentlemen, Diana will be seated over here to sign the beautiful books for those of you that wish to purchase them. So please do make your way there, and don't forget the refreshments at the back as well. Thank you very much.
That's great. Oh.